In the rich amalgam of West African history, few periods are as remarkable as that of the Oyo Empire. For a century and a half, from roughly 1680 to 1830, the capital city of Oyo Ile and its king, the Alaafin, were a dominant force, shaping the destiny of nearly all Yoruba peoples and their neighbors. This was an era of profound change. For centuries, the city of Ife had been revered as the ancestral home of the Yoruba, and its king, the Oni, was seen as the father of all Yoruba rulers. But in the early 17th century, following decisive wars with the neighboring Bariba and Nupe peoples, a new power began to rise from the resettled city of Old Oyo. The Alaafin of Oyo Isle started to challenge the centuries-old paternal authority of Ife, setting the stage for a new empire. The capital city, Oyo Isle, was not a monolith. It was a complex confederacy of lineages organized into wards, each led by chiefs entitled elders. At the heart of its political life was a fundamental tension between two competing principles of power. On one side was the Oyomesi, a council of 7 chiefs from the most powerful non-royal lineages. Their power was immense. They held the right to confirm or deny a candidate for the throne. In the most extreme circumstances, they could demand that a reigning king renounce his crown and commit suicide. The Oyomesi shaped the city's internal policies and represented a principle of decentralized authority, a confederation of powerful families. Each chief was also the patron of a major religious cult, weaving their political power into the spiritual fabric of the city. On the other side was the Alaafin, the king, chosen from one of Oyo's 3 royal wards. The Alaafin represented the opposite principle, the centralization of authority in the crown. He was the supreme judicial authority. He controlled the succession of chiefs. And when he wore the sacred veiled crown, he was considered Ekiji, or Risa, the companion of the gods. To execute his will, the Alaafin commanded an elaborate court of palace officials, eunuchs, bodyguards, and tax collectors, who managed the affairs of the state. This constant struggle for power between the Alaafin and the Oyomesi would become the engine driving Oyo's expansion. The king needed to establish a power base outside the capital, one that could provide him with revenues and resources beyond the control of the powerful chiefs of the Oyomesi. The key to Oyo's military might was an innovation borrowed from its northern rivals, cavalry. Against the horse-mounted armies of Oyo, many Yoruba towns to the south were defenseless. The expansion began in the early 17th century. First, the Alaafins consolidated the northern territories around the capital. Then, they pushed east, establishing their authority over the Ijesa, Igbomina, and Ekiti peoples to counter the influence of the powerful Benin kingdom. Their cavalry, however, was ineffective in the difficult terrain of Ondo and Edenry, marking the limits of their eastward expansion. The empire's gaze then turned south. Carefully bypassing the ancient city of Ile-Ife, Oyo forged alliances and exerted influence. The kingdom of Awu became a close friend, and Oyo asserted its power over the northern Egba towns. By the latter half of the 17th century, Oyo's authority extended southwest into the lands of the Egbado and Anago peoples. By the beginning of the 18th century, Oyo had become a true empire, a confederacy of crown towns and trade centers covering nearly 18,000 square miles and ruling over perhaps 1 million people. This power allowed Oyo to achieve one of its greatest military triumphs, the conquest of the coastal kingdom of Dahomey between 1726 and 1730. For the next 50 years, the Oyo Empire was the dominant power in the region. However, military and economic power are not enough to sustain an empire. A claim to rule requires legitimacy, a shared belief in the ruler's moral and divine right to authority. Successive Alaafins sought this legitimacy, first by claiming direct descent from Oduduwa, the mythical founder of the Yoruba people at Ile-Ife. This claim, however, was contested by the Oni of Ife himself. Court histories in Oyo shifted over time, sometimes claiming their king was the youngest son of Oduduwa, and later, the first son, reflecting Oyo's growing ambition to assert primacy over the ancient spiritual home. But Oyo found an even more powerful source of divine legitimacy in the figure of Sango, the deified fourth king of Oyo. The worship of Sango became the empire's greatest cultural legacy, a complex mythology that both justified the Alaafin's power and warned of its dangers. The myths of Sango paint a picture of a flawed and terrible ruler. One story describes him as a ruthless tyrant who pitted his chiefs against one another until his people, weary of the discord, dethroned him. Lone and abandoned, he hung himself at a place called Koso. But his followers, using powerful charms, caused violent thunderstorms to rain down upon his enemies, setting fire to their homes. They proclaimed that Sango had not died, but had become an Orisa, a god, and that the lightning was his vengeance. They chanted, Abakoso. The king did not hang. Another myth tells of Sango's fascination with magic. While experimenting with his powers, he accidentally unleashed a terrible storm that killed his own wives and children. Listen to a fire outpour. Chained, he left the capital and took his own life, only to be deified when subsequent storms were seen as a manifestation of his divine rage. These myths created a powerful political metaphor. They projected an image of the Alaafin's awesome, terrifying, and unpredictable authority to conquered peoples. The Sango cult was uniquely intertwined with the state. The Alaafin's own bodyguards were initiated into his cult, and his priests acted as agents of the empire, collecting fines from households struck by lightning. Sango was the divine justification for the Alaafin's power, a king so mighty he could command the storms even in death. The greatness of the Oyo Empire depended entirely on the strength of the Alaafin at its center. Under a powerful king like Alaafin Abiodun, who reigned until 1789, the vast confederacy was held together. But once he was gone, the old cracks began to show. The internal struggle for power between the new, weaker Alaafins and the Oyomesi reasserted itself, and the center collapsed. The empire's weakness was a signal to its enemies and its subjects. The Homi rebelled, critical trade routes to the coast were lost, and to the north, a new threat was gathering. The rising power of the Fulani, fueled by missionary zeal and the political ambitions of local chiefs in the city of Ilorin. When the British explorer, Captain Hugh Clapperton, visited Oyo-E in 1826, he found a capital city still rich with culture, its palaces and homes adorned with elaborate carvings. But he also saw the writing on the wall, making note in his journal of Oyo towns that had already been plundered by Fulani armies. Within a decade of his visit, the art he described would vanish. The final blow came swiftly. Around 1830, Oyo-Ile was besieged by forces from Ilorin. After a final, crushing military defeat around 1835, the great metropolis was deserted. Its citizens fled, and the enemy swept in to plunder what remained. A Yoruba historian, Samuel Johnson, later wrote, "Such was the fall of the great metropolis, Iyo or Katunga. The ancient Oyo still lies in ruins." Within 45 years of its greatest ruler's death, the capital city of the Oyo Empire no longer existed. The fall of Oyo was not the end of the Yoruba people, but it was the end of an era. The royal court fled south to establish a new capital, but the Alaafin's authority was a shadow of its former self. Former military outposts, like Ibadan and Ijaye, now led by ambitious warrior chiefs, rose to fill the power vacuum. The collapse of the empire plunged the Yoruba world into more than half a century of brutal civil war. The Oyo Empire rose on the back of military innovation and the political will to centralize power. It fell when that central authority fractured, proving that its imperial structure, for all its might, was ultimately ephemeral. Yet, while the empire as a political reality was gone, its powerful cultural legacy endured for another century and more. The stories of its kings, the structure of its politics, and most of all, the potent, ambiguous, and enduring worship of the deified King Sango continue to shape Yoruba art, religion, and identity long after the walls of Oyo Ile had crumbled into dust.